Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this exclusive webinar hosted by Bibby Financial Services. My name is Aoife McGinley. I'm the Head of Client Services here in Ireland, and I'll be your host for the next 45 minutes or so as we delve into the economic trends, financial challenges, and the geopolitical landscape to hopefully gain some expert insights to help plan and prepare for the year ahead. I'm delighted to introduce Mark O'Rourke, our Managing Director, who is on the front lines listening to our clients, and he's here with us today to share some key insights into the challenges and opportunities that you, our clients and business associates, may be facing. And we're honoured to welcome renowned economist Jim Power. As a leading voice on the Irish economy, Jim's insights are highly respected, and he's here today with us to share his expertise on the 2025 outlook and what to expect. So, the running order for the next, as I say, 45 minutes or so, Jim will kick us off with the 10-15 minute presentation, giving us an overview of the economy. We'll then move into a discussion around the current business mood in Ireland amongst SMEs and, of course, the geopolitical landscape. Towards the end then, we'll have some time for Q&As, so we encourage you to actively participate by submitting your questions right throughout the webinar via the questions section on your screen now. Okay, so let's get started. Mark, Jim, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Aoife.
And Jim, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Aoife. Thanks, Mark, for inviting me to do this morning. Welcome, everybody. Over the next 15 minutes, I'm just going to take you through sort of a quick overview as to how I see the world at the moment, what I see happening in the Irish economy, and finally, some perspectives on the vitally important SME sector. I just want to begin by summarising the world in 2025 as I see it. This probably warrants about a day and a half, but I'll try and get through it in a few minutes. But I think it's become so obvious over the last 10 years, particularly, since the Brexit referendum in 2016 and the election of Trump later in 2016, and everything that has subsequently happened, that the world of geopolitics just has such a huge impact on the world of economics and finance. And I think you could certainly say at this juncture, geopolitical uncertainty is incredibly intense, with a lot of wars going on around the world, with a lot of political polarization. And of course, all of these political events do have significant economic consequences. The global growth outlook at the moment is extremely uncertain. And I think that really flows from what's happening on the geopolitical front, because obviously the cloud overhanging all of this is the new president of the United States, Donald Trump. And what we've seen in his first number of weeks in office is total chaos, incredible chaotic uncertainty is being generated. And from day to day, we've no idea what his latest initiative is going to be on the tariff side. But suffice to say that he has succeeded in generating an incredible level of business uncertainty. And I think and economic uncertainty, obviously. And I think from a business investment perspective, uncertainty is the key enemy. And certainly that is the key characteristic of the world at the moment. One of the key themes in the global economy over the last few years has been, first of all, the surge in inflation that we saw in 2022 and 2023. And then we saw the central banks around the world react aggressively with significant interest rate tightening happening from the middle of 2022 onwards. Over the last 12 months, inflation has come down significantly. And I think looking ahead for the next 12 months, it's possible to say that not quite that the battle against inflation has been won, but I think inflation is going to behave significantly better than we've seen in recent years, which is a good thing. So in other words, inflation moving back to the sorts of levels that central banks want, which is around 2%. The US does pose a risk in that regard, because it remains to be seen what Donald Trump is going to do in terms of injecting fiscal stimulus into the US economy. It's also I think instructive to look at the impact that tariffs might have, because tariffs on imports into the United States feed directly into consumer prices. And of course, the problem is that if countries retaliate by implementing their own tariffs. So, example, anything we get from the United States into Europe, if tariffs go on that, it is going to feed through to higher inflation. So, I think fiscal stimulus in the States and the impact of tariffs definitely poses the greatest challenge on the inflation front. Another key risk out there, and this has been highlighted very significantly over the last few weeks, and that is what's happening on financial markets. Okay, we've seen bond yields surge towards the end of last year. They've come back down in recent weeks, but very, very volatile. We see a lot of governments around the world with significant levels of debt, and the United States being probably the best example of that at the moment. We have a lot of irresponsible fiscal policy, and I think this applies to the United States more than anywhere else at the moment, because if Trump does implement the sort of spending changes and the tax changes that he's spoken of, that certainly will feed into a higher level of debt in the States. We had a lot of AI euphoria last year, which drove stock markets to incredibly high levels. But in the last few weeks, definitely we've seen a change in sentiment about the equity market outlook, and markets have now fallen back to the levels that prevailed just before Donald Trump was elected last November, because after he was elected there was a view he'd be good for the US economy. Equity markets benefited from that, but because of what he's doing on the tariff front, there is now a real risk. And certainly this is how markets are seeing it at the moment, that the US economy could enter recession in the last 12 months, and equity markets are now starting to reflect that. On the interest rate front, I guess from an Irish perspective, the most important thing to look at is what the European Central Bank will do from here. To date, the European Central Bank has introduced 6 interest rate cuts, totaling 1.5%. After the last move, the ECB did roll back a little bit, suggesting that the pace of cutting from here on will slow down. But I would think that in the next 12 months, there is strong justification for at least another 1% off ECB interest rates. So whether it's a half, 3/4 or 1%, I think the key point is that rates will continue to come down, and how far they come down will be determined by how the European Central Bank perceives the Eurozone economy, number one, and number two, the inflation outlook. But obviously, the big element of uncertainty is the Trump presidency. And that's why, and I hate saying this, I like to be definitive in terms of my economic prognosis, but the characteristic at the moment, the key characteristic, is uncertainty, volatility, chaos. We really have no idea about what Trump might do next and the impact of that. So uncertainty, unfortunately, is the key theme at a global level. Excuse me. If you look at the sort of chaos that the Trump presidency is creating, I mean, it's all driven by this America First agenda. Everything that Donald Trump and his administration are now trying to do is based on the notion that it has to benefit the United States. He believes that by imposing tariffs, it will bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. That's not going to happen, but that is the doctrine. Everything is about the United States, and indeed, the global role that the US has traditionally played economically and politically is certainly now under significant pressure, and that is something that Trump is trying to engineer. He's anti-free trade, he's anti-free trade agreements, he's using tariffs as a leverage tool, and actually at this point in time, it's impossible to be definitive about what exactly is happening on the tariff side, because one day he announces 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, for example, and then a day or two later he rolls back and say we'll postpone it for another month. So it's deeply uncertain. We have seen significant tariffs go on imports from China already. So we're in a global trade war at the moment, and countries are retaliating. We see the Canadians, for example, increasing the price of electricity they sell into the United States by 25%. He talks about cutting the corporation tax rate from 21 to 15%. From an Irish perspective, that would be very significant. He's talking about deporting undocumented immigrants, and undocumented immigrants are a key part of the US economic model, particularly in areas like hospitality and agriculture. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And if you delve down through it all, I mean, it does pose significant risks for the global economy. It does suggest that the US budget deficit is going to widen further, and that obviously could feed into equity market and bond market volatility. And as I said earlier, it could result in higher inflation in the States. But generally, it is all feeding in through a much more competitive global geopolitical environment. So I go back to the point I made earlier on that, everything just smacks of uncertainty at the moment. And from a business perspective, as I said, uncertainty is always a key enemy. Looking at the Irish economic backdrop, the economy was showing solid momentum coming into this year. If you look at the performance of the economy last year, domestic demand was reasonably strong. Inflation fell sharply. Employment at the end of last year reached 2.776 million, which is the highest level on record. The unemployment rate at the moment is at 3.9% of the labour force. The public finances are very strong, with tax revenue buoyancy on VAT, income tax, and particularly corporation tax a key characteristic. So coming into the year, definitely the Irish economic backdrop is a pretty positive one. As I suggested a few minutes ago, interest rates will fall further over the next 12 months. It's a question of how much rather than whether they're going to happen or not. The programme for government has obviously been published and a government has put in place in recent weeks. It now remains to be seen how effective the government is in terms of the delivery of that programme for government. So I think from a sectoral perspective, a look at that programme for government is instructive because there's a lot of sector-specific stuff in there, particularly for the SME sector. And it's fine to go out and suggest that this is what we're going to do as a government, but obviously the delivery of that is a different issue. So I think that we watch the delivery over the next year or two to see how impactful the new government is going to be. From a business perspective, if you look at the global economic backdrop, it is characterized, and I keep using this word, by uncertainty. And in an uncertain environment, I think businesses need to be cautious. I think cost control will be a feature of the business environment here over the next 12 months. And I think it should be, actually, given the level of uncertainty out there. And I just wonder about what's going to happen on the employment front, because I get the sense, and there's nothing scientific about this at this juncture, but I certainly get the sense that a lot of companies have probably overhired at this stage in anticipation of continued good times into the future. So perhaps the threat posed by Donald Trump and his policies could force a more cautious approach from business in the next 12 months. This is a breakdown of the labour market performance in the final quarter of 2024. I think these slides will probably be made available to your clients, so I'm not going to go through in any detail, but suffice to say that at the end of last year, a record level of employment in the economy. One of the issues I think facing businesses, particularly in the SME sector and particularly SMEs that are exposed to the consumer. Okay, the headline rate of inflation has fallen from a high of 9.2% in October 22 to currently running at about 1.4%. So the headline rate has come down, but there is a legacy effect. And basically the cost of living in January 2024 compared to January 20 is 19.8% higher, and there's a breakdown there of some various elements of consumer spending. But suffice to say that this is really a manifestation of the so-called cost of living crisis. It is causing a pressurized consumer, which in turn is feeding into a more challenging environment for the SME sector. I think one of the big issues in Ireland is the concentration risk. At the end of last year, there was 302,566 people working in the FDI sector, and for every one job in an FDI in a multinational, there's about 0.9 of a job supported in the rest of the economy, and that is typically in the SME sector. So it just shows how important the FDI sector is to Ireland. Corporation tax last year accounted for 36.2% of total tax revenues, which is a record high. 11 billion of that was due to the Apple tax payment, a further 3 billion of which will be delivered this year. But the point about it is that Ireland is just incredibly dependent on a small number of multinational companies. And I think nowhere is that clearer than on the corporation tax side, where in 2023, 10 companies paid 52% of corporation tax. And the obvious risk would be if any of those companies get into difficulty, it could have significant implications for the corporation tax take. The SME sector, I have always been a strong advocate of the importance of the SME sector because I skipped through the last slide pretty quickly, but the clear message is that Ireland is significantly exposed to a small number of multinational companies. And there's two ways of dealing with that. Number one, you try and make the environment for multinational companies as positive as possible. And that's important. But in the face of the potential threat that Trump poses to the multinational sector here, that may not be enough. The other way of dealing with that concentration risk is to make sure that we create as viable an alternative economy as possible, and that is the SME sector. 99.8% of businesses in Ireland are SME. That's in a numerical sense. The SME sector, it's very difficult to sort of characterize the SME sector in any single term because it is made up of thousands of very different businesses across the economy. But they are, I think, all facing similar challenges. Labour costs have risen significantly. And it's not just the wage side, it's also stuff like changes to sick pay. It's the potential for auto enrollment to be eventually introduced. So for SMEs, the cost of employing people has just been rising significantly in recent years. Insurance costs still represent a major problem. The whole regulatory environment for the SME sector is really pressurizing them because the cost of regulation needs to be considered. As I said, SMEs are dealing with a pressurized consumer. The recruitment and retention of labour is a significant challenge, 3.9% unemployment rate. That is an economy that is virtually at full employment. So that means recruiting, retaining labour is a challenge. And of course, labour costs are under pressure. I think if people look at the Trump FDI threat, there is a sort of an attitude, well, that's an FDI thing. It doesn't have anything to do with the SME sector. But the reality is that the FDI investment in Ireland is an incredibly important support for the SME sector because many SMEs provide goods and services to the SME sector. So any SME business owner out there, do not believe for one moment that what Trump is doing is kind of irrelevant to your business, because if the FDI model here is undermined, it will feed into the SME sector. I believe, and I've argued this for a number of years, that there needs to be a much stronger focus on widespread support for the SME sector. And I have argued for some time that what Ireland needs is an IDA type body with specific responsibility for all elements of SME business, because the SME sector has got to become a more important counterweight to FDI concentration risk. One of the interesting events, I think, of recent times has been, well, if you go back to the Brexit vote in 2016, Ireland's relationship with the United Kingdom, and indeed the EU's relationship with the United Kingdom, has been seriously diminished But I sense in recent times that Keir Starmer is trying to rebuild the UK's relationship with the European Union, and I think in the face of the Trump threat, that agenda is actually being promoted and encouraged. So the UK and the EU are now starting to engage, but also we've seen the UK trying to rebuild its relationship with Ireland. So I think, for SMEs who sell, I think the UK market could once again start to grow in significance. So I think that really is one to watch, rebuilding the relationship with the United Kingdom. Okay, I think I'll leave it there. Just to summarize, as I see it, the threat to the FDI model from Trump obviously is significant. Micheál Martin and a number of Irish government ministers are in the United States this week. So I think it's important to try and build up as strong a diplomatic relationship as possible with the United States. But listen, when you're dealing with people like Trump and JD Vance, I'm not sure how much diplomacy actually works, but we've no choice. I think in vital strategic areas, energy, water, and particularly housing, if I was to pick one item that needs to be addressed, it is housing. It is the most important element of Ireland's challenge into the future. And as I say, more attention to be paid to the SME sector. I'll leave it there. This is a blatant commercial for a podcast I do called The Other Hand, where we discuss these sorts of issues on an ongoing basis. But I'll leave it there and I'll hand back to Aoife.
Thank you, Jim.
Skipped through a lot of stuff. Maybe
Not at all. No,
enough,
look, some really good stuff and really useful insights. Thank you for that. Just pick up on one or two of those points there, and actually just on your last slide, the last point you said there was more attention to SME sector. So this is one of the challenges that Ireland faces in 2025. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think, as I say, in numerical terms, SMEs, 99.8% of businesses in Ireland, about 65% of business employment is provided by the SME sector. Mm-hmm. They're an incredibly important component of regional economic activity, particularly. Mm-hmm. They're a key element of the tourism sector and so on. So it's an incredibly important part of the economy that I believe never gets the sort of attention it deserves. And do you think you did mention that they're setting up a particular body? Like, do you think the government could be doing more for the rising costs for the SME sector? Yeah, I think the sort of impact analysis that has been conducted has been totally lacking. Because if you look at the measures that have been introduced in recent times, what's happening on the minimum wage side, the move towards a living wage, the introduction of auto-enrollment pretty soon, the changes to sick pay, all of these measures that are being introduced by government, there has not been enough impact analysis done to see how they will really affect the SME sector. And the reality is, many SMEs are operating on very tight margins, a pressurized environment. So if government is going to introduce those sorts of measures, it needs to make sure that it compensates those SMEs in other areas, subsidies,
like
whatever.
And
that's why I go back to the point that having a body with specific responsibility, a one-stop shop basically for the SME sector, is really important. And it's to help. Obviously, some SMEs export, a lot of them don't, but it's to help those businesses deal with all of the challenges that they have to deal with.
Very good. I'll just bring Mark in here. I suppose we see our own clients worry about the increasing costs of doing business, but they're also in growth mode. So how are you seeing that they're balancing that need to grow, but in a high cost environment?
Yeah, no, look, it's obviously very interesting listening to Jim there, and probably just hot off the press as in yesterday I got the headlines of our own customer or SME sentiment survey that we run, and actually 64% of respondents would say that costs/inflation is a real concern for them. But actually also 88% of them would say that they're optimistic for 2025. And 67% would say that they've seen an increase in sales, in the last 6 months, and 71% expect to see an increase in sales in the next 6 months. So I suppose it's, the the cost inflation is there, but also the growth mindset and the real growth that's happening as well. So strategically, I suppose to your question with regards to what can they be doing, I think, there is an appreciation that you just can't keep passing costs on. It becomes a bit like a pyramid scheme that you get to somewhere and the whole thing collapses. I think also that you can't cut your way to growth as well.
Yeah.
So because the important piece for SMEs with their customers is the value that they bring, why their customers choose them. So you can't do anything that would sacrifice the value that you bring to your customers. So I think what are people looking at? Well, how can they become more effective?
Strategies that you see?
How can you become more effective or be more efficient with what you have, and actually making sure that you're actually delivering the same quality to your customers. I think the use of technology as well. This mention of AI. I think also really looking after the existing client base that you have as well, because it's actually more expensive to acquire a new customer than to actually retain an existing customer, and to achieve growth is making sure that you maintain the customer base that you have and that you can incrementally build from there.
Yeah, actually we're seeing a significant increase in M&A and MBO activity amongst our client base. Do you see this trend continuing in the SME landscape?
Well, I do, because that's exactly what we are seeing. I think and a big part of that for us is obviously our relationship with PTSB. So we're seeing quite a number of those opportunities, and I think there's many factors for that. I think generational, that you'll have some business owners that maybe you've been through the last crash, you've been through COVID, and now, as Jim's saying, God knows what you might potentially be facing into with Trump, and say, probably now is probably a good time for me to pass it on or to cash in. So for sure, we are seeing it, and it's across a number of sectors as well, actually. So it's not pinpointed to
any
one
particular sectors.
Recruitment, particularly. I think transports, wholesale, and sort of services areas.
Yeah, popular. Okay, just supposed to come to the hot topic and the geopolitical landscape, and you mentioned, Jim, in your presentation that uncertainty is a key enemy, and definitely the uncertainty is becoming more intense.
Yeah.
I suppose, how can SMEs plan in such an uncertain environment? Do you have any tips or advice?
Yeah.
Are they pausing investment or what?
I mean, I feel deeply uncomfortable in giving a presentation and talking about uncertainty. I like to be definitive, but I've just spent the last 2 weeks in the United States and talking to a lot of business people, and they are totally at sea at the moment. They have no idea what economic policy is in the States. And when business is faced with that sort of uncertain environment, they just cut back on investment. They rein in. They wait to see will things eventually settle down. So intense uncertainty characterizes the business attitude in the States at the moment. And from an Irish perspective, as a small open economy that is seriously exposed to the global economy from a trade perspective, from a foreign direct investment perspective, we are really at the cutting edge of this sort of global uncertainty. So that's the word, uncertainty. So how do businesses deal with that? I mean, I totally agree with Mark's point there about looking after your existing client base is just so important, because in an environment of intense uncertainty, going out getting new business is obviously going to be more challenging, because your clients or potential clients out there, they are also behaving the same way. They're becoming more cautious. So holding on to your existing clients, servicing them well is really important. I think cost control is going to become more important. Absolutely key. And I'm not suggesting that this is one of the problems. When there's a cyclical downturn in an economy, one of the first things businesses do is cut the marketing budget. Okay.
Is that a good or a bad thing?
Well, I think it's a bad thing, to be honest, because you need marketing more when you're in a downturn than when business is flying, to be honest.
Absolutely.
But still, it's one of the easiest costs to take out. But I think businesses need to focus in on all of their costs and see what is geez, I'm starting to sound like Elon Musk here, but you look at the costs that may not be essential.
Yes. Okay. Very good.
So I think a more cautious approach.
Approach.
And I hope I'm wrong, and it's that everything will return to normal, that the economic environment here over the next couple of years and the business environment will be fantastic.
Yeah.
But I think it is really important from a planning perspective to recognise the real risks that are out there at the moment.
Time will tell.
And I remember hearing another economist, Dan O'Brien, say last July on radio that Donald Trump represented the most existential risk to the Irish economy, and he's absolutely correct, and that is now materialising in a very strong
Mark,
way.
come to you. Are clients concerned? Harry, what are you hearing from them on the front lines?
I think Jim has probably said most of what's going on in everybody's head. I think it's people don't know what to think, because you have and let's remember, it is the President of the United States of America, that we're talking about here. But that he could say something now, and half an hour later he might say something completely different. And it's how do you actually plan for that? And I think he said the only thing that is certain is the uncertainty. So look, it's hard to plan around, but I think it's the other side of all of this is how will Europe react? If there are tariffs put on Europe, and then what
sort of timelines would we be looking at if that goes ahead?
I honestly don't know, Aoife, but what I find fascinating as well actually is that we have Micheál Martin now over in the US, and I would give him credit. He gave good advice, sort of just nearly cool the jets, everybody, and take stock and don't do anything rash, which is probably the most sensible advice there is as well. But I think from an Ireland Inc. point of view, he's obviously over there trying to promote and make sure that the US is aware of how important we are to them as much as they are to us. But we are also members of the European Union, so it's that sort of, well, will Ireland get a special deal? Is he looking for a special deal for Ireland? Or are we European? Are we Irish? So I think it's uncertain, but it's quite fascinating uncertainty as well at the same time. So there's so many streams going on. To try and nail your colours to any mast is just not possible.
But the warning signs are there for Ireland in terms of what Trump has said to date. He's identified, and he has a list of countries that run trade surpluses with the United States. And Ireland has a goods trade surplus. Okay,
we're high on that list.
We're high on that list. He will ignore the fact that we actually import a lot of services from the United States. He will just look at the merchandise trade situation and see Ireland has a massive trade surplus with the United States. So he's mentioned that. Second thing he's mentioned is chemical and pharmaceutical, okay? And 65% of Ireland's merchandise exports last year came from the chemical and pharma sector. Most of them driven by US companies. So he's looking at that as well.
And I think exactly that. And back to your point, Jim, with regards to the MNC versus SME, and I'll always be an advocate of why we can't have the best of both. And point you raised there with regards to the costs and the living wage and sick pay and auto enrolment, and back to the government. What can the government be actually doing? And Aoife, I think you mentioned there with regards to subsidies, because if you come back
there's nothing in the plans at the moment, is there? Yet these are coming down the line.
You come back to then if people have to look at cost cutting, then jobs could be a real part of that. Because they can't afford to employ. But actually, if the government can help subsidise, it will help protect employment as well. Because the alternative to not subsidising potentially is that people become unemployed, who then become dependent on the state. And from a pure, and Jim, you're the economist here, but from a pure, monetary point of view, is it better that the government, give a little bit towards SMEs to help retain the employment levels, or have people, essentially on the dole?
I mean, at a social level, a lot of these measures like minimum wage, living wage, auto enrolment, sick pay changes, they're all positive from a social perspective. And it's difficult to argue against them. But government has got to recognise, if we're going to implement all of this stuff, it is going to increase the cost of doing business for SMEs that are already pressurised. So we've got to make sure we have other policies in place to offset those.
To support that.
And that's what's
lacking. Okay, just moving on to, and you've touched on it a little bit about technology and digital technology and AI in particular. So I suppose we're seeing technology replacing face-to-face engagement more and more. Do you think, Jim, we're losing the art of the business relationship?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I do actually, but we're not unique. I go back to my experience in the States over the last 2 weeks. Customer service is pretty awful. Okay, and here, I don't want to engage in bank bashing or anything like that. But if you look at the traditional bank customer relationship, it has really broken down over the last few years. And that has all sorts of impacts. But one of the impacts is obviously it makes life much more difficult for small businesses particularly.
Yeah.
So I would love to see a business model that starts to, it probably sounds, I sound like a dinosaur, I sound old fashioned, but I think business relationships really is what it's all about at the end of the day. And it's not a business relationship that's driven by a machine. It's a business relationship that's driven by people. And if you look at some of the strategies of the traditional banks at the moment, it's all about cost cutting rather than investing in customer relationship. But we see that across many sectors of the economy.
Absolutely. I suppose, Mark, looking at ourselves, and I know we're very passionate about relationships with our clients and leading the way, I suppose, in being a relationship-based funder. What do you think of these technological advancements, and do you think they might impact on how our clients or SMEs out there engage with funders?
Yeah, well, I think the general answer to your question, much as Jim has said, is yes, technology has impacted, and look, we all see it ourselves. You pick up the phone to ring your bank and there's a voice, and it's not a human voice that's at the end of it and is asking you questions, and then it doesn't understand you and you end up shouting at the phone to try and to get anywhere, which is obviously frustrating, or maybe that's just me, but glad I'm not the only one, and then if you take it into the SME world as well, and again from stats from the client or the SME sentiment survey, businesses are being rejected through algorithms. That the banks or financiers are using algorithms to make decisions on SMEs. Where we are different and what we're fairly proud of. When you ring us, you will talk to a person. It's guaranteed. We don't have that technology. We've no interest in that technology. And when we make our credit decisions, it's based on actually us having been out either with our existing client portfolio or prospective new clients and going out and meeting them, meeting the people, understanding the story behind the numbers. Because the numbers will tell you one thing, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. But it's understanding the people. You're backing the people as much as you're backing the numbers, and how there's no AI or algorithm is going to give you that feel when you can go out and what we do as well. So it's not that we do it from the office. We or bring people to us for these meetings. We're out across the whole 32 counties, actually meeting SMEs. And understanding their businesses, understanding their requirements. And, back to Jim's point earlier on there with regards to 99.8% of businesses are SMEs, right? Yeah. So that's basically every business, right? Yeah. So why, and I was nearly going to swear there, but why wouldn't you give them that level of service, of listening? These are the people that are out that are putting their necks on the line to employ your brother, your mother, your father, your sister, who then are going down to the local coffee shop, to the pub, they're contributing to the local GA club or soccer club or whatever it is that keeps
that whole
ecosystem
working.
going.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think the least they deserve, and maybe it is a bit of a dinosaur view, as you said, Jim, and maybe it is a dying art, but it's something that we're incredibly proud of. And I'd probably say, our last net promoter score, which we run twice a year, was 56.
Yeah, so very proud of that.
We are very proud of it.
The banks would be very typically lower.
Probably
for
minuses,
that reason.
But we're also not content either, and I think that's the thing. And obviously you're a big driver.
And we are, and good to hear. We're very passionate about that, those face-to-face relationships, and I think, as you say, you can't replace technology, can't replace that, and understanding businesses, and no two businesses are the same. So an algorithm doesn't solve that for
No,
sure. Conscious just to get to
Yeah,
a couple of the questions here, because we've got a few coming in online. So just want to make sure we get to those. One here. Can you give a quick summary of Northern Ireland's prospects this year? This particular client's based in Dundalk. Should we be looking north for growth? Jim, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental thing that is, as I said, that has happened in the last few weeks particularly, is Keir Starmer is trying to rebuild relationships with Ireland, okay?
Yeah.
And I think that's really
Been proactive
positive
in that,
because, okay, the UK has fallen dramatically in significance from an Irish trade perspective, but SMEs are still focused a lot on the UK market broadly, but particularly the English market. And I'll answer the question about Northern Ireland in a second. It's the easiest market. The UK is the easiest market to sell into from a cultural point of view and so on. And logistically, it's much easier. And whatever about the English market being easy, the Northern Ireland market is potentially much easier, okay? Because, you know, you don't even have to bring goods and services across the sea. You can bring them across the border. So I think, I think actually the future for the Northern Ireland economy is a pretty positive one, because it's coming from a low base. Massive investment is required in building up the private sector, but I think it is going to happen. And I think definitely for Irish businesses, taking an increasing look at Northern Ireland is really could be really beneficial. Absolutely, because believe me, Northern Ireland businesses are increasingly looking at the southern market.
Absolutely. Another one in here, I'll just read out quite a good one. Would you not agree that the worldwide reaction to the Trump behaviour provides hope that we will see stronger economic relationships between countries that have not existed in the past? While maybe painful in short term, there could be positive outcomes from this. What are your thoughts?
Well, maybe
go,
if I
go ahead, Jim.
And I see examples of that even in the last 2 weeks. The European Union is starting to become more united again, and that is some achievement. You see the French, the Germans, and the UK, obviously not in the EU, but Europe is definitely starting to become more united. Likewise, Canada. There is even speculation in some quarters that Canada should look at joining the European Union. And given that Australia can take part in the Eurovision, why not?
Yes, I mean, why not? Yes.
Yeah, and Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, the new Prime Minister, who may not be there very long because he's going to have an election in the next few weeks. But Mark Carney is... he has strong Mayo and Cavan connections, and he's very pro-Irish. You know, from his time as governor of the Bank of England. He really is. Yeah. So I think we need to build relationships with countries like Canada as well. So I totally take that point. Actually, while the whole Trump thing engenders uncertainty and volatility and negativity, it actually could be very beneficial in terms of building other relationships. We have to.
Great. I'll just take another question here that's come in. What do you believe the impact in terms of capital investment will be for Irish SMEs, and how the current uncertainty is likely to impact Eurozone interest rates? Jim?
Eurozone interest rates are coming down.
Yep,
you know, it's a question, as I said, of by how much rather than whether they do come down or not. Because the Eurozone economy is fundamentally weak at the moment. It needs lower interest rates. So that's a positive for the SME sector here in terms of investment. But offsetting that positive from interest rates is the general uncertainty out there.
Of course. Mark, any thoughts on that?
No, I've nothing to add to that.
Okay.
No, Jim says so. That's good for me.
Very good. Very good. I'm just conscious of the time, but we've one more question just come in here online that I'll take because it's an interesting one. It's for you, Jim. One of our online audience members says, would Jim ever consider running for politics? And if not, why not?
Number one, I'm too old. Number two, I couldn't imagine somebody voting for me.
Okay, very good. Listen, thank you all for listening, and thanks very much for the participation and the questions in online. That concludes our webinar for this morning. Thank you to Mark and to Jim for your very insightful thoughts and opinions there. Hope you enjoyed the webinar, and have a very good morning.